pop in with any questions. We're covering GMAR Addendum A today. And so before we jump into that, I just want to address in the offer to purchase where you are attaching any additional addenda to incorporate into the offer to purchase. So Addendum A is not a requirement, but I would say it's attached to the offer like 99% of the time. Even if you're not incorporating, specific contingencies, some of the language that's in Addendum A that I'll go through is just nice to have attached to the offer. So, whether you're writing a residential offer to purchase or a condo offer to purchase, I would encourage you to attach GMAR Addendum A. Any additional addenda is always attached on the last page of the offer, kind of in the middle of the page, line 573. You would check this box here and you would say the attached blank is made part of this offer. So you just write in which addendum are you attaching. So it's usually Addendum A, Addendum S if it's property built prior to 1978. There's a rental addendum, which is Addendum R. There's an occupancy addendum, which is Addendum O. Sometimes agents will use an escalation clause addendum, or, which is either Addendum EC or sometimes it's called an accelerator clause, so AC. So these are just any additional documents that you're attaching to the offer. So I'm going to go back and I'll open GMAR Addendum A. So before I do that, I just want to point out there are two different Addendum A's. So in the WRA library, if I go, let's see here, Addendum A to the offer to purchase. So this is like the state version of Addendum A, and it's very short. It's like a 2-page document. The first page has a few different contingencies, like it has a radon contingency, but that's already been moved into the offer to purchase, so wouldn't need that. There is a testing contingency and some additional components to it. The reason why I don't recommend using this one is the GMAR version of Addendum A is much more robust. It's 4 pages. It includes most of these. I think the only one it may not include is the map of the property. But it includes most of this plus a lot more. So I'd say it's common practice in our area in southeastern Wisconsin to use GMAR Addendum A, and it's specifically created by our association. You'll find if you happen to do a deal like maybe in Sheboygan, kind of northern counties, or even further west, like towards Madison, you might see agents using the regular Addendum A. But for today's training, we're focusing on the GMAR, the Greater Milwaukee Association of Realtors Addendum A. So you can see it's still called Addendum A, but at the top left, recognize that it's basically provided by the Greater Milwaukee Association of Realtors. This was updated this year, I should say must have been end of last year, a year ago. So you can see you've got a use date of December 1st, 2019. So with all addendum in the first section, you're basically referencing the offer to purchase. So what's the date of the offer, who are the buyer's names, and the property address. Now we'll get into the meats and potatoes of the addendum. I do want to quickly point out, because this came up last week, and this is referenced in the offer to purchase. Lines 5 to 6 state that the provisions preceded by an open box are part of this addendum if marked such as with an X. They are not part if marked NA or left blank, except as provided on lines 7 to 9, which states, for optional provisions in the offer which require a box to be checked which have not been marked NA or stricken in their entirety, if any blank with any part of the optional provision has been filled in, then it shall be as if the appropriate box was also checked, thus including said optional provision with the offer. So this happened to an agent. They received an offer that did not have a checkbox by inspection contingency, but it did have one of the boxes was filled in to say a number of days, basically saying there was a 15-day inspection contingency. The listing agent interpreted it as, okay, there's no checkbox here, so therefore this provision is not, or this contingency is not included. However, as it says on line 7 to 9, if there's a value here or a deadline or a date included in the line, even though this box is not checked, it is deemed to be included as a part of the offer. So always something to be cautious of when you're drafting an offer, as well as when you're reviewing offers as a seller, as a listing agent, that if there is anything included in the values here, it's deemed to be included in the offer to purchase, even if there's not a checkbox. So just something to keep in mind.
I was just gonna say, I always let people know when writing an offer to just, if they're not gonna include a contingency, just to make it a practice to write NA.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yeah, so if you're not, and really, I mean, I think they say in like the, sales class that if you're not completing lines, every box should be completed. So if you're leaving a box, never leave a box blank, basically. So if there's no text to be, then you're putting strikeouts through that. And same thing, if you're not going to ask for a home warranty, okay, we're going to put NA in that box to acknowledge we're not putting anything in. That way, if something is accidentally inserted, this value supersedes this. Yeah. All right. So, okay, for seller's contribution. So this is essentially if buyer is asking for seller to provide any kind of closing cost credit. This box here is solely for a loan to be applied towards a loan cost credit and or prepayables. So the buyer's lender needs to be made aware of any of those credits being given to the buyer. And that the language here states that anything not applied as a loan cost credit or prepayable shall be credited back to the seller at closing. So if you're writing an offer for a buyer and the buyer's trying to determine, well, how much money do I want to ask for in closing cost credit? If I do want that, I would always verify with the buyer's lender to ensure that their closing costs don't exceed this number. Because essentially to a seller, it's just less money that they're going to be getting at closing. So less money out of their proceeds. So buyer may say, like, let's say the house is listed at $200,000. Buyer may say, okay, I'm going to give you $200,000, but I'm also asking for $5,000 in closing cost credit. A seller is going to look at that. Okay, this is an offer for $195,000. It really doesn't impact them in any way. It's just the end, what are their proceeds? Lenders will typically say like closing costs would be roughly 6% of the purchase price, but I don't think usually they're not that much. And buyers are able to get like closing costs removed or I should say partially waived. So the risk to the buyer is if they ask for too much, they could potentially lose some of it. So always good to verify with the lender.
And actually, Kimmy, the guideline I usually give is 3%.
Oh,
good.
Somebody at one point told me 6%, and I was like, that just seems really high.
Yeah.
And I actually had this happen to one of my sellers. The buyers in their initial offer, it was like $150,000 house, and the buyers had like $7,000 in closing cost credit. And I was like, wow, that is really high. But overall, it was like a good offer for the seller, so they took it. And the sellers ended up pocketing I think their closing costs only ended up being closer to $5,000. So that $2,000 just went back to the sellers and their proceeds at the end. So it was basically like money left on the table by the buyers.
Yeah.
They could have negotiated the price down more or something.
Yeah.
When you're talking to your buyers, you should say, okay, and just so you know, closing costs will be somewhere around 3% of the purchase price. Sometimes buyers may ask the sellers to cover this. It weakens the offer. I wouldn't recommend it, kind of thing, or?
Yeah, I would say buyers should only ask for it if they really need it. If If they need, I would say, closing cost credits typically tend to be about 3% of the purchase price, but I always recommend verifying with your lender what your closing costs are going to look like for you. Because it's kind of unique for every buyer. And then, yeah, if it's something that the buyer's like, yeah, this, having the seller cover some of those costs, so I don't have to bring as much money to closing would be really helpful. Then definitely include that in. Yeah, but it's something, like you said, it makes the offer look less appealing, basically cutting this from their proceeds.
Gotcha.
And another point to make is to offer it as a negotiating tool on inspection.
Okay.
And save it for that.
Yep. So if there's any like minor repairs, buyer can ask for seller to cover closing costs at that time.
Okay, perfect.
All right, the next piece, the home warranty program. So this is where a buyer can ask for the seller to pay for a home warranty, or the buyer could just simply say, I'm going to be ordering and paying for a home warranty. Most of the time, a seller, a listing agent will advertise in MLS if they're offering a home warranty. If they are, it absolutely still needs to be included in the offer. Just because it's advertised in MLS, if it's not in the offer, the seller is not obligated to pay for a home warranty. So here is where a buyer would check, okay, yep, I want a home warranty. It states that it shall be included effective on the date of closing. So that's what warranties are, typically 1 year. And it even states shall be for a term of 1 year, provided that the property qualifies for the warranty plan. The cost of the home warranty shall not exceed blank. So typically what you'll do is, unless the seller has already ordered the home warranty, you could say the seller is going to be paying for it. So the cost of the warranty will be paid by the seller. So you would strike out buyer. And the warranty plan will be ordered by the selling agent, meaning the buyer's agent. So that gives you control as the buyer's agent to order the warranty that you think is best for them, whether it's RWS, which is who our firm partners with, or it's some other home warranty company that you prefer. And then you can use, okay, I know RWS charges $600 for their warranty based on the square footage. So then that will help you determine the number here. And honestly, I mean, most home warranties are, it totally depends actually. RWS is a little more expensive, I think, just because they calculate theirs based on square footage, where like HMS and I forget what the other one, they were more like $495 to $500. So if the seller is ordering a home warranty, you can always confirm with the listing agent, hey, what's the total of that home warranty that I should be acknowledging in the offer to purchase. But I would say, ideally, the seller hasn't purchased it yet, and you could then have the power to the control of ordering that warranty on behalf of your buyer. Line 18 acknowledges if there's an association fee. So specifically for like a condo or a homeowners association, we would acknowledge that here as well. Lines 19 through 27 are more or less a disclosure that it states that real estate agents may furnish a list of inspectors, but it's basically up to the buyer to do their due diligence as to whether they have an inspection and who they're hiring to do the inspection. So it's more or less a disclosure. Okay, lines 28 through 33. This is a big reason why GMAR Addendum A is typically attached to the offer to purchase, is to be able to have that testing contingency. Without a testing contingency, buyer would not be able to test for mold, asbestos, or anything else that needs to be, if they take a sample, water testing, where they take a sample and they bring it to another location to get tested. So even if they have an inspection contingency and the inspector recommends, hey, I see something that looks like mold, I recommend getting this tested. If they don't have this testing contingency, the buyer technically cannot test. So that's one of the biggest things that comes up is mold or asbestos, where, you don't think that you're going to find it and then you do, and the buyer's like, oh crap, like I want to be able to test for this. So what I've seen, as far as what you insert on lines 29 to 30, you do have to list specific tests. It states that the offer is contingent upon buyer obtaining a current written report documenting the results of the following tests conducted, blah, blah, blah. So you do need to list specific tests, and it does give examples. So asbestos, mold, or other substances or conditions which may affect the health of occupants or the value or structure of the property. So what I've seen is listing out the specific tests: mold, asbestos, water, and you could even include in here any other substance or conditions which may affect the health of occupants or the value. Oh, baby.
It was over the bouncer situation.
Oh, cute.
And real quick on that testing contingency, is this something that if you're getting an inspection contingency, it's pretty common that you would put that in there? It's not like a turn off or anything?
No, I would say it's pretty common. And then what I like to do is listing the testing, but then also saying that only if recommended by Wisconsin licensed home inspector. Basically saying, like, I'm not just going to go test for mold assuming that there is mold. I'm only going to do it if the inspector deems it to be necessary. Yeah. Kevin Mattson is joining us here. All right. And then as far as the deadline goes, you can keep it the same number of days as your inspection contingency, or if you have a shorter inspection contingency period, like 10 days, I would maybe say 15 for the testing, just because with testing, if you are having to test, that would involve probably a follow-up party coming in after the inspection has been completed, them taking the samples, and obviously it's going to take a couple days for those results to come back. So I would recommend doing the testing contingency a little bit longer than the inspection contingency period. And then you're acknowledging who is paying for it. So with all testing and inspections, it's typically the buyer's expense, which is what the default is. And then whether or not the seller shall have the right to cure. So I would keep the right to cure, whatever you indicate for the inspection contingency, do the same for the testing. That would be kind of my default. All right, the next few contingencies are really more applicable if you're writing an offer on a property in a rural area. So well water testing, I should say well water and well system. There are definitely still some within the Southeast Wisconsin area that have wells, private wells, but for sure septic. Those aren't really that common within the North Shore area, but again, as you get further out in the rural areas, you'll want to have these contingencies in here only if the property is serviced by a private well and a septic. So these contingencies work a little bit different, where they're kind of backwards, where basically the deadline is just like so many days prior to closing. So instead of the deadlines running from acceptance, it's flipped. It's so many days prior to closing. And I think the reason for that is just they take longer to satisfy. So for a well water testing, if there's an active well serving the property, this offer is contingent upon the buyer receiving no later than, and default is 15 days prior to closing, a written report dated no earlier than 60 days prior to the date set for closing, indicating that the well water is fine, that there's safe levels, or should I say no unsafe levels of bacteria, nitrate, arsenic.
Are the well and septic information usually in the MLS listing? Is that something you should always ask like the listing agent or?
Yep, so in MLS, kind of in the details area of the listing sheet, it'll acknowledge whether it's municipal water or a private well. And same thing with the septic. It would say municipal sewer. If it's municipal sewer, it's not in a septic. Otherwise, I think it says septic, I think. So yeah, make sure, especially if you're writing an offer on something more rural, verifying how is the water and the sanitary system served. The other thing that with these contingencies, and it referenced in the well water testing, that it states the report shall be dated no earlier than 60 days prior to the date set for closing. So I believe, and I'm not a total expert on well and septic, but I believe like if you are on a private well, you by law are required to get it tested every 5 years, I think. I believe municipalities might have different rules and regulations with that. And then with the septic, you know, on a frequent basis, you need to get it pumped. And with that septic being pumped, I believe that they inspect it as well. So they signify in the offer that that needs to happen no earlier than 60 days prior to the date set for closing. So a seller can't use a report from 4 months ago with those results. It has to be within so many days of the closing date. So that's something to consider when you're talking with a seller. You know, on the flip side, hey, okay, you've got a septic system. Don't pump it. Don't get it pumped in the next, let's wait till we get an offer. And then at that time, we'll get it pumped and inspected. That's happened quite a few times where sellers, you know, just take it upon themselves to do that before listing the house. And then a buyer tries to do an inspection and the inspector's like, I can't inspect this because it was just pumped. So I can't do it. But again, they all work very similarly. So I don't want to bore you with all the details, but again, you're acknowledging who's paying for it. So you'll notice that with these, the seller is the default for obtaining the reports and paying for getting those reports. I think that's pretty common. I don't see many offers where buyers say the buyer is responsible for obtaining the reports. Most of the time you're relying on that default that the seller is paying for the reports. And then the buyer can dictate whether the seller shall or shall not have the right to cure with all these contingencies.
In like all these different instances where it might say, you know, seller if neither is stricken, do people usually just always strike though? I mean, just.
Yeah, I would say there are definitely agents that don't, but I would say that's just being kind of lazy and always want to verify that you're striking. As the compliance broker, I would say definitely strike. Don't rely on the default, strike through every opportunity or every, point. It's just good to go through the habit of verifying, okay, what are we doing in this specific instance? There is a little bit here on an abandoned well that would be disclosed. I believe there is a disclosure in the real estate condition report. And it says if there is an abandoned well, what the seller is obligated to do. So that's the other great thing about GMA or Addendum A is there's just a lot of these disclosures that, you know, may not apply to every transaction, but when they do, like, oh, this is an abandoned well, what do we need to do? Here we go. It's telling us exactly what we need to do. Or if it's a shared well. So in the top of page 2, it outlines with the right to cure regarding all of these contingencies on the first page. So what happens in the event a notice of defects is delivered. So it outlines all these things. So it does work a little bit differently than the inspection contingency. So, you know, if you ever do need to include these contingencies, I would recommend you read through this thoroughly to understand how the right to cure works for these specific contingencies. All right, there is another disclosure here about the sanitary district sewer construction. Buyer is informed that the property may be located within an established sanitary district. Buyer may be subject to taxes, special assessments, or other charges for sewer planning or construction, user fees, and related costs. Buyer is encouraged to contact officials of the sanitary district to inquire about such costs. So again, just another disclosure. This is something, again, I've never seen this disclosure, so I'm not sure where this may happen, but just something to pay attention to if you see it pop up on a condition report or an MLS. All right, the next piece is a big reason why I love GMAR Addendum A is that it references some additional finance language related to the financing commitment contingency. So there's just additional terms. So they state, and again, this is just the language that's automatically incorporated into the offer once this is attached to the offer to purchase. So within 7 days of acceptance, the buyer shall obtain a written confirmation from a financial institution that the buyer has applied for financing. So this is separate from your pre-approval letter. This is saying, let me read on it. Seller may, no earlier than 7 days after acceptance, deliver a request for written confirmation of the application. So after 7 days after acceptance, the seller can say, hey, buyer, show me that you've applied for financing. And the buyer would be obligated to provide a written proof from their lender that, yep, this buyer has applied for financing. Some listing agents are very diligent about asking for this. Some buyer's agents have just made it a practice, even if they haven't had the request from the seller, they still send that letter from the buyer's lender. Hey, he just want to send you acknowledgement that the buyer has applied for financing. This is just a way, obviously the financing commitment contingency is like one of the last contingencies to be satisfied. So by providing this documentation to the seller, it just shows good faith that, yep, buyer is moving forward with, their contractual obligations. They have applied for financing. They're working towards that, providing you loan commitment. So it's just a nice way to keep both parties on the same page to work towards that successful closing. It states that the buyer agrees to pay any and all costs for obtaining financing, including the cost of closing the mortgage transaction. There may be additional costs for the first year, premium for private mortgage insurance, extended coverage insurance, flood insurance if required. This is another thing I love. It defines what exactly is a loan commitment. So in the offer to purchase, buyer is saying, okay, by this date, I will have delivered loan commitment to you. And if not, seller, you have the right to terminate the offer. So a loan commitment is defined as a commitment from a financial institution authorized to do business in the state of Wisconsin, which does not include a condition requiring the sale of other property unless the offer is contingent on the closing of other property. So this is a big one. If your buyer has a house to sell, but they're like, you know what, I don't necessarily need to sell that house in order to buy this next house, so I'm not going to include a home sale contingency. In order for the buyer to properly deliver loan commitment, that loan commitment cannot have a condition that, hey, buyer must sell their home. Otherwise, they're not meeting the requirement to deliver the loan commitment. So just a nice thing to note. Buyer, and last piece of this, buyer acknowledges buyer's obligation to have the total purchase price, including mortgage loan proceeds, available at the time of closing. Buyer is advised to determine when buyer's loan proceeds will be funded to ensure that the funds will be available at the time of closing. And there's a notice here. The closing company may require parties to wire funds necessary for the completion of the transaction to the closing company's account. The parties acknowledge this requirement may result in an additional cost to be paid by buyer unless otherwise agreed to in writing. So this is good to note, and it's good to just kind of take note of all of these additional expenses that a buyer might incur with purchasing a home. So maybe it's something you make part of your buyer consultation, especially with first-time home buyers. A lot of first-time home buyers are not aware of, I have to pay for an inspection. You're going to have an appraisal that you're going to be paying for. And a lot of those expenses kind of come out from the lender side with their closing costs. But, you have earnest money you're going to have to be putting down. That's going towards your purchase price, but it's money that's going to be cashed or taken out of your bank account at the time of an accepted offer. So all these little fees that come along the way, it's good to give buyers a heads up, especially if you're one of those buyers that's kind of very type A and, looking through everything with a fine tooth comb, that they're aware of these fees and just provide you less headache later on. The next section acknowledges more about the waiver of financing commitment. So if the buyer, if it's a cash offer, buyer is not making the offer contingent on financing. It states if the buyer waives the financing commitment contingency, making this a cash offer, and within 7 days is the default of the delivery of the notice of the waiver of financing contingency, buyer delivers written verification from a financial institution or a third party that the buyer has sufficient funds to close. So it's just another acknowledgement that the buyer must deliver that proof of funds within 7 days.
Sorry, so really quick, just to confirm. So then I tell the buyer, okay, we just need you to tell your lender that we need that financing commitment letter. And then, so they'll go to the lender, then they'll give it to me, and then I can give it to the listing agent.
So as far as, the loan commitment, so if the buyer is getting financing, that's what you.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, for the previous.
Yep, if the buyer is getting financing, so your step would be, okay, let's say buyer gets an accepted offer. Hopefully the buyer has already established who their lender is. Usually it's from the lender they've gotten their pre-approval letter from. Then what agents typically like to do is kind of be that point person of contact between the buyer and lender. So you could say, hey, send me your lender's information. I'm going to email the lender a copy of your offer to purchase. So once you get the signed offer, I always like to email that directly to the lender. Say, hey, I'm the buyer's agent for your client, so-and-so. Here's a copy of the accepted offer. And then I also send over the deadline for buyers to deliver their loan commitment is December 15th. And then most lenders then will keep you updated as the transaction progresses. So, okay, hey, appraisal's been ordered. It's scheduled for this date, time. And they'll keep you apprised as they move forward with the loan commitment. And then it's kind of on you as the buyer's agent to stay on top of the lender. Some lenders are really, really communicative, and they'll send out communication every week, whether there's an update or not. They'll just send out, here's where we're at, or here's what we're missing, here's what we're waiting for. If you're not working with one of those lenders, I would say super important to stay on top of them. Hey, how are we coming with appraisal? Where are we at with loan commitment? And making sure, I can't stress enough those dates and deadlines, putting them in your calendar. So if okay, loan commitment is due on December 15th, I'm gonna follow up with the lender a week prior to ensure that we're on track to get that loan commitment. So kind of being that point person of communication between all of your buyers people, so the lender, their inspector, and then communicating all that through to the listing agent. That's a great question.
Okay, sorry. What's the question?
No, really good question, because sometimes I forget about those. Just like, I mean, it's like basic, I would say, but it's so important. And how would you know? I mean, so thank you for asking that.
And this is like my next basic question. So all these dates, of course,
Yep.
I've bought and sold a couple homes, so I know there's a lot of dates.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like something in command where you put them all in and it will send you reminders, so you are staying on top of those dates?
That's a great question. I don't know.
Or do you just agents putting in their Google Cal themselves, and that's how they keep track? I'm just want to make sure, because obviously it's one of probably like the most important things to make sure.
Yeah. So I know there's like checklists that you can build in Command, and I don't know. I will look into that, and if there is, we will for sure do a training on it because that would be awesome. Because our old system used to have that. My process was always to put it in my calendar, and then I would have like a label that I would label them as like my contract deadlines. So everything pink always had my contract deadlines. That's how I kept track of them. I always also had like every transaction I had like a paper file folder, and I would just write on the cover of the file folder, okay, here are the dates and deadlines. And it was just something that every week I was tracking. So you kind of have to find a system that works best for you, but Command might have something that you can build yourself within your opportunity. So I'll check with Lindsay on what those look like. But for sure, I would say putting them in your calendar is probably the easiest way to track those deadlines. Okay, the next piece of Addendum A, kind of middle of page 2 here, is talks about the VA, FHA, VA, or USDA mortgage. So if you're working with a buyer who's getting one of these, this would apply. It does say if this offer is contingent upon buyer obtaining an FHA, USDA, or VA loan, the parties agree to execute an FHA, VA, or USDA amendment to the contract, which shall give buyer the right to terminate the offer if the property fails to appraise for the purchase price. So this is just, you'll receive this amendment from the lender. So just know that it's just an additional piece of paper that all parties would need to sign if it's an FHA, USDA, or VA loan. So this is just important to keep in mind, especially too, if you're representing a seller, so that they're aware, hey, buyer's FHA loan, this is what it means. They can terminate the offer if it doesn't appraise. And then the other big difference is the appraisers are usually very picky about what they find at the appraisal. So FHA appraiser or VA appraiser may ask for more repairs to be done if the property has peeling paint or just other safety issues of the property. So the seller also agrees to pay the lender at the time of closing a tax service fee not to exceed $100. And then specifically if it's a VA mortgage, checking this box here, acknowledging who's paying the funding fee, not to exceed blank percent. I would verify if you're working with a VA buyer, check with the lender of what percentage should be indicated here. I don't think I've ever worked with a VA buyer, so I'm not really sure what the percentage typically is. So just verifying with the lender. The other piece, and this is newer with the VA loans, buyers are required to have an insect inspection. So again, if this offer is contingent upon the buyer obtaining a VA loan and the property is in a county where an inspection for wood destroying insects is required, who is paying for it, the buyer or seller, shall be responsible for obtaining a report by a VA approved operator. And again, typically this would be the buyer expense, getting that termite inspection. Buyer may terminate this offer by delivering written notice within 7 days as default after receiving the report revealing any damage. All right, the next few sections are more disclosures. So area conditions, just talking about if the property is in an area, existing and future residential, recreational, commercial, and or industrial development, road and or freeway construction, sewer or water, other public utility construction, area-wide reassessments, and or airport expansion may affect the property. Just an acknowledgement to the buyer that they're aware, if it's near an airport, highway, industrial development, farms, may be affected by noise or odors. So just keep in mind, a lot of these disclosures have been inserted. I would imagine at one time the Addendum A was much shorter. Same thing with the offer to purchase. So these things get added in as lawsuits arise. So it's a way of, hey, buyer, hello, beware. A lot of these are buyer beware disclosures, so that it's on you to do your due diligence. If these are something that's going to be a material to you, that noise might be an issue, or the odor, don't buy this house. if it's in an area that the property may be impacted by that. This disclosure is somewhat similar, more or less talking about asbestos, lead-based paint, unhealthy concentrations of mold, radon gas. Buyers encouraged to consult with, the appropriate experts, do their due diligence, etc. Underground storage tanks and basement fuel oil tanks. I believe this is also a disclosure in the real estate condition report that seller is definitely obligated to disclose if there is a underground storage tank, especially if there is one currently in use. And so it just states if seller has notice or knowledge of an underground storage tank, or if one is discovered prior to closing, it's the seller's responsibility to deliver to buyer confirmation that the tank, related components, and or closure are in full compliance with all federal, state, and local regulations. Then there's a zoning and building restrictions, comprehensive plans, non-conforming property, and building permits disclosure. This talks about municipal zoning and building restrictions affecting the use of the property. This is just, really long, boring disclosure about zoning. Buyers encouraged to take necessary steps to obtain an endorsement or modification of buyer's homeowner's insurance for protection. It does have a disclosure that firms and agents are not required to investigate whether the required building permits have been obtained, zoning and building restrictions, comprehensive plans, and non-conforming property status. Buyers advised to check with the applicable municipal authorities regarding existing zoning, shoreline zoning, building restrictions, possible plans, and building permits if these issues are material to the buyer's decision to purchase. So it's interesting with the building permits. So especially I would say if it's like a flip, buyer may want to consider verifying with the village that all permits have been closed. So I recently sold my house, and when I bought, never thought of this, verifying permits are closed. The sellers did not close out. I found out when I sold my house, the buyers of our house did their due diligence. They went to the village and asked, hey, are there any open permits on this house we're looking at buying? Turns out there was an electrical permit and a roof permit that were never closed out. So the expense to me as the seller ended up being, in order to close out the electrical permit, we had to have about $2,000 worth of electrical work done. And the roof permit, we had to reopen the roof permit, which was like $140. The village just came out, said, okay, great, done. And then we closed it. So it's just silly expenses that never really even thought were possible. But so it's just something as a buyer's agent might want to check if you're aware the seller did some extensive work in the last couple of years. Hey, let's just verify all the permits have been pulled. And that's just a quick phone call to the municipality. There's a disclosure about information on promotional materials. So buyer understands that the information which is contained in the MLS and additional promotional materials is obtained from a number of different sources, which has not been independently verified or confirmed by the various real estate firms and agents who have been and are involved in this transaction. If any particular measurement or data element is important or material to the buyer assumes all responsibility and liability to research, verify, and confirm said data element and measurement. So again, if your buyer's talking about room sizes, square footage, if that seems material to them, just making them aware, okay, hey, maybe we should get this verified by, maybe you need to take a tape measure just to verify room sizes, or maybe that needs to be a contingency in the offer. I've never seen that, but I have seen where buyers maybe learn after the appraisal that, oh, this property is not as large as I thought it was, or that room isn't as big as I thought it was, that's material to me. I don't want to buy this house anymore. So again, it's probably not something you need to have an in-depth conversation with your buyer about, but if they start bringing it up, just knowing that this language is in here to help you have that conversation with them.
Okay, sorry, I just
Yeah.
have been thinking about you in this permit situation. Just curious, like, were you more upset with like yourself or with your agent? And do you think that like as an agent, I should just, you know, if I'm working with a home that definitely like in TOSA, everything's always getting redone, whatever, that I should just take it upon myself to call just so it's done, if it is just a quick call, or should I tell them?
I would say, so I would say I was more upset with myself because I was the agent. I was also kind of upset with the previous owners because they were agents as well. Like they should have known, and they didn't disclose that the permits weren't closed, but regardless, water under the bridge now. You know, it's a good question as to whether you should just take it upon yourself. I think I would have the conversation with the buyers first and just say, hey, you know, I've heard, and I think everything is very situational. So if you've, if the property, as you can tell, was redone in the last couple of years, I mean, again, it is a disclosure on the condition report that a seller is obligated to disclose whether or not permits were pulled and or I don't know if it states that they were closed out. I think it's maybe assumed that if permits were pulled, then they've been closed out. But yeah, I think I would just have the conversation with the buyer, and if it sparks concern with them, yeah, I think we would want to know if these permits have been closed out. Then you can take it upon yourself to call on their behalf. And I think really the bigger properties to look out for are flips that may not appear to be the most professional flips. And you can kind of tell when you're in the house that if they're kind of an amateur flip, those would be the ones that I would probably be more concerned about. And I would probably call even before consulting with the buyer. The other thing you can do, especially if it's a property that's like currently under construction, like it's being flipped during this, you know, sale, you can make that a contingency. So a buyer could say, seller shall provide proof of all permits being closed out, you know, no later than 10 days prior to closing. So you could include that as a contingency in the offer. All right, the other piece, next piece is the survey. So a survey is not required to be provided by the seller. So again, buyer, you know, if this is something that's important to the buyer should either include a contingency that allows them to get a survey or request it of the seller. Disclosure about floodplains, wetlands. Buyers aware that the floodplain wetland maps referred to in the offer lack detail. Buyers encouraged to personally examine such maps or consult with appropriate government officials to verify. All right, skipping ahead here. Insurance provisions. I'm not going to go through all these, but just be aware that they're here. Rental property ordinances, lead service line ordinances. So this is more common. It specifically references the city of Milwaukee. Requires that the owner pay for the replacement of privately owned portions of lead water service lines whenever the following occurs. This was, honestly, I'm not sure if this is still happening, if the city of Milwaukee is still updating the service lines, but there are links to the website here that, you know, if you have a buyer purchasing in the city of Milwaukee, you might just want to verify this information or direct your buyer to these websites so they can confirm whether or not this property is like on the list to be updated, for those service lines to be updated, because there may be a special assessment the buyer may incur later on if the property is undergoing that update. City letters, no later than closing, seller shall provide buyer with written verification of paid real property taxes. This is handled with the title company. And then it just states that any provision of this addendum be in conflict with any provision of the offer, the provisions of this addendum shall prevail. But like I said, this addendum was updated around the time that the offer to purchase was updated, so they should be, you know, very, very similar as far as their some of the language. This is an additional place where you would attach addenda. So like I was showing you on the offer to purchase, where you're going to show the attachment of GMAR addendum A, you can acknowledge here any additional addendum. So lead-based paint, you would check the box, and the label for addendum for the lead-based paint is addendum S. If you have an occupancy agreement, that's addendum O. Rental property is addendum R, and then you can include any additional that you might have. So another common one is escalation clause, which is EC, etc. If you're writing an offer on a property where the listing firm doesn't hold earnest money, they'll typically have an additional addendum, so that you would incorporate that as well. And then the last piece I want to go through here, which is one of my favorites, is this additional contingency section. So this is basically a template for you to add like any kind of random contingency your buyer wants. And it's essentially fill in the blank. It's whenever you're writing an additional contingency, you always kind of want to ask the questions of who is, or actually what is the contingency? Who is doing something, when, by when must that something be completed? Just answering those questions so that it's a really complete contingency. So this is read as this offer is contingent upon blank. Here's an example of one I've seen. Buyers, maybe if the buyer lives in San Francisco and they're writing the offer sight unseen, but they're flying in this weekend and they want to see it. So maybe they want to make it contingent upon them seeing the property. So you would insert this offer is contingent upon buyer viewing the property on or before, and then you're going to give a deadline. Okay, this has to happen by November 21st. In the event buyer disapproves of property for any reason, buyer may, at buyer's option, terminate this offer by written notice delivered to the seller within 3 days after this deadline. And should buyer fail to notify the seller, the buyer shall be deemed to have waived this contingency. So you can use this for anything. If the buyer wants a room painted, or they want something removed from the property, or they want repairs done. Now, typically repairs are addressed after acceptance, but it could be any number of things. I also like, even after acceptance, if the buyer needs to include an additional contingency, just referring back to this language, and obviously be drafting an amendment to the offer to purchase, but you can go back and reference this language and use it to insert it into the amendment. So I love that template. And then the last piece of Addendum A is a big additional provisions box. So any additional language you need to add. And then I should say the last piece really here is just including information about the buyer's firm and the seller's firm. And all this information can be found in MLS. If you're the buyer's agent, you would put your information here, and then all the information for the seller is then in the, like I said, the kind of the bottom portion of MLS, if you're looking at the private version. Any questions? And then with the addendum, buyer's initial and the seller's initial. So always make sure you have all parties initialing additional addendum. Any questions before we wrap up here for the day?
I don't think I have any others. You answered all of them as we went, so thank you.
Absolutely. All right, well, if there's no other questions, thanks for joining me today, this gloomy Monday. And yeah, we'll see you all next week.
Bye. Thank you.